Is welfare a drain on a country's resources, or should policymakers maybe be thinking about it as an excellent way to deliver a targeted stimulus in a crisis? And if they did, what sort of impact should they expect? So hello, Max, welcome.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Now, Max, one of the ways in which fiscal policy can cope with a crisis, a huge crisis in this case, is to send everyone a check, and that's what we've seen happening in the US. Do economists all agree that these untargeted cash transfers are a good use of resources?
Well, firstly, economists never agree on anything, so certainly not this one, I can tell you that for sure. So I think broadly you kind of get these two sort of classifications of opinions on this sort of topic. You get the kind of more classical Keynesian, as we call it, economists who would say, well, actually, this is a great thing because if you're giving people cash, they're going to go and spend it in a domestic economy. So if I go and buy a book from a bookstore with this new cash that's sort of fallen into my lap, then that bookstore can employ more people. That's going to give wages to more people, and it's going to end up flowing around the economy multiple times. And we measure that by what we call a multiplier effect. So that a ratio of that initial increase into the output. So if it's like 1.5, you get a nice sort of good effect in the economy because it's getting it over 1. That's a good thing. But then you get these other economists who take a more critical view, and they're becoming more and more popular as the days go on. So if you think of someone like John Cochrane and Robert Barrow, these guys say that, well, look, if you give people cash, people aren't stupid. If I get £100, £1,000 from the government, I'm going to know that in the future a tax rise is going to come and it's going to have to pay for this stimulus somehow. So really the savvy consumer is just going to save that cash and it's going to not do anything. You're going to get a multiplier effect of 0. So you kind of get these two different competing views of saying, really, what do people spend? How do people spend money? How do people choose to spend money that falls into their lap? And if you're going to take the view that people are really savvy and they don't spend the money that falls out of the sky, then the effect of fiscal stimulus is wasted, and giving cash to everyone is just a complete waste of resources. So that's one view, and others take a different view, but that's broadly where we're at the moment.
Could we counter the John Cochrane objection by saying, all right, well then let's give money in this case to the people who are likely to spend it? Do we know who those people are? That's
the critical question. And for people like John Cochrane, he'll say, well, to understand how people choose to spend money, you have to look at their own financial resources. And it's really important that we do this. So firstly, what we're looking for really is people who have enough cash already in their bank account. So if you give money to the richest people, if you give it to Jeff Bezos, if you give £100 to Jeff Bezos, is he going to spend it? Probably not. He probably won't even notice it. Absolutely not. So really what he's saying is if you have enough cash in your bank account, if you've got enough liquidity, you've got maybe your credit markets, you've got your assets, you've got all these sorts of sources of cash. If you give these cash to people, then they're not going to spend it. And data actually does support this. 80% of the population usually in these studies finds that there is no effect, that they don't spend the money because they have enough cash. That's a lot of people. 80% of the population doesn't spend stimulus. It's a big number. So John Cochrane says, stimulus is completely circumscribed, as he says. It's useless because most people don't spend it because they have enough cash. So that begs the question, why don't we give the money to people who don't have cash? So who are these people who don't have the kind of cash in their bank accounts? They're the ones who are going to be responsive by his own logic. And he'll say himself that is exactly what we're looking for. We're looking for people who don't have this they don't have employment income, they don't have assets, they don't have market income or any kind of income themselves. So why can't we give the money to them? And that's the critical question for stimulus. But there's a practical problem with this. It's very well and easy to say, well, look, just give it to the people who don't have income. But how do you really quickly identify who these people are in the economy and give them money at the onset of a recession? Bearing in mind at the moment, interest rates are at 0. Central banks are constrained in how they can really respond, who are usually the people who are left responsible to deal with a recession. So in that kind of environment, government's got to react quickly. And how can it identify everyone in the economy that doesn't have a particular level of cash and then give them cash? And also justify it to the population. It's quite difficult to go and say, well, look, there's this sort of criterion that we're using that this kind of household who has low assets, who has this sort of ratio of incomes, no one cares. No one wants to know, that the neighbor who looks like they're in a similar financial position to them is going to get a check. Why don't I get the check? So there's a political problem and also a speed problem that is a real big issue, and that makes stimulus really, really complicated to deliver to the people that we actually want to deliver it to, the people that are going to spend it. So then you have this problem where you can't do it efficiently, so you have to do it indiscriminately, as we say. So that stimulus check that you mentioned in the US was pretty indiscriminate. I mean, you'll try and say, well, it's beneath people who have less than £100, I think, in savings or just in income, but that's still really inefficient. And you get these critics who say, well, look, if there's only a really small minority of people who are going to spend the money, what's the point? And it's a good objection. It's difficult to argue with. So the question for economists is, how do we find the people who are going to spend the money, and what's the most efficient means that we can give them the stimulus and them only?
Which brings us to what you did in your paper, because you looked in the UK at universal credit and whether that was targeting the people who were credit constrained. How does universal credit work for people who don't know about it?
Well, universal credit is the welfare system that has amalgamated all sorts of welfares that have come in the past. So usually welfare is something that we build up over generations, that we have job seekers allowance, we have PIP for disabilities and so on, and you get these multiple facets of welfare programs. Universal credit tries to bring it all into one ether. And then tries to sort of motivate people to go into work. Now, regardless of what your sort of morality opinion is on that, that is broadly the kind of goal that they're trying to achieve. There's some slight differences also in how we describe means-tested benefits versus universal benefits. So a means-tested benefit is if I go and say, look, I have a really low income and I need support, they're going to check whether I qualify. There's an eligibility criteria to get welfare. And then you have a more universal system like child benefit, where you'll get anyone who has a child it doesn't really matter about your income. So my question for my paper that you mentioned is, if you think about means-tested welfare, what a means-tested welfare is doing is looking for people who have low cash, who don't have assets, who don't have an income. And remember that conversation that we've been having about how do you look for these people who are going to spend cash? That sounds awfully similar to the kind of criteria that John Cochrane sets out, saying, look, how do you find these people? My suggestion is we already do. We do this every day. The universal credit system that we always lament as being this drain on the economy, weirdly, it seems to be transferring cash to the people that we want it to. Why can't we consider universal credit as literally the world's biggest cash transfer program that is going to fix all these problems for us? So if we're looking for these people who are fitting this criteria, my suggestion is, well, why don't we look into the welfare system? And the research question really was twofold. One is saying, well, what percentage of welfare recipients are going to be credit constrained, those ones who are going to spend stimulus checks? And whatever number we get from that, what is the economic effect if we just raise benefits as opposed to doing this indiscriminate cash transfer? So why don't we do the opposite that all governments do usually in a recession, which is to give cash to everyone, cut taxes or something like that, give cash to broadly everyone in the conversation in the population, and then cut welfare to pay for it. Now, that's the opposite way around that I was suggesting. So why don't we try and raise welfare, because it's going to give money to the people who are going to spend it, and what's going to be the economic effect of that? So that's broadly the goal of the paper. And just to give you a little synopsis of what I found, shock horror, the welfare system in the UK transfers by and large to the biggest population, the biggest constituency of credit-constrained consumers, those guys who are going to spend cash in an economy. They're really sensitive to a change in temporary income. So if we raise the temporary income of welfare recipients, we're going to get a really strong economic effect, because they're the guys who are going to spend that £100, £1,000, whatever. But also on the flip side, and this is really important, if you lower the income of those sensitive credit-constrained consumers that are overrepresented in welfare programs, you're going to get a really big negative contraction on the economy, because so many people are going to have to lower their consumption as a result. If I'm not on universal credit, if you cut my income, I'm not going to really respond as strongly and as hard as those guys on universal credit are. So that's really the finding of the paper is, look, if we're looking for credit-constrained consumers, you're going to find them really easily in universal credit, which also is a big plus because we know who they are. We can just raise their income really quickly, which fits one of the criteria. It's also politically justifiable to raise the incomes of the poorest people in the country, rather than trying to find them and distribute it, directly. So that's another big plus. But by and large, it's really economically powerful. And this really runs against what we normally think about universal credit. We think of it as a drain on the economy. But actually, if the recipients are sensitive to temporary income changes, we should be raising incomes in recessions, and we should really be thinking twice about how we cut them.
Well, for the last year, Max, this hasn't really been a thought experiment, has it? Because the UK government did target extra payments at recipients of universal credit. Were you able to establish what overlap there was between the recipients of universal credit and these people who are credit constrained?
So that's the goal of the paper. So I look at, what is the representation of credit constrained consumers in those welfare programs. So I use a series of techniques, but I find 71% of welfare recipients are credit constrained. It's a huge number. When you think about what is that for the population, usually papers find 20%. I found just above 20%, so it's in that ballpark. That's a small slither of the population, and again, really difficult to target because they're semi-random in how they're distributed. But in the welfare system, it's 71%, and that goes even higher when you start to look at some specific welfare programs. If you think about the welfare cap that was introduced in universal credit, so that caps the amount of money that you could physically claim from the system, regardless of characteristics. That's one of the ones that targets 91% of credit constrained consumers. So that's bringing the incomes down of 91% credit constrained consumers. So that's a really strong, powerful effect if you start to mess around with their income. So that 71% is on average just across means tested welfare, because, as we said at the beginning, it already targets them. It's already using that criteria. So that's a big effect, and we have to be really, really careful about how we approach universal credit in the future.
Your argument is that the multiplier from these payments is going to be greater than 1. How can you estimate the size of the multiplier in this case?
So I use a new Keynesian model, which I think economists will be sort of maybe familiar with. But if your audience members who aren't familiar with the new Keynesian model, that's taking that sort of Keynesian argument I mentioned at the beginning, that sort of first class of opinions, and it's taking a sort of a mathematical model that builds on that kind of intuition, and with lots of algebra that would make most people run away because it's pretty extensive. But you can't end up with a number which is, for me, was 1.5 from positive changes. So that really means for every £1 of welfare that you give to a welfare recipient, it's going to translate to 1.5 in output. That's higher than 1, meaning that we're going to get more in output than we actually spend in just giving it to them. So it's getting greater and greater as it goes along. And then for the negative side, that same new Keynesian model finds a fall of 1.8. So every £1 you cut in welfare reduces output by 1.8. Again, that's a huge number. Most studies into multiplier effects don't normally find numbers this high. This is quite unusually big. Sometimes you do, but it's very, very rare, which really speaks to the fact that the amount of people that are going to be targeted from a welfare change in welfare contributions is really strong. When you have those high numbers, those 71% of people who are going to respond to welfare changes, you're going to get these big numbers, and you can get these big responses. Obviously, more work needs to be done into this kind of field. This is a very novel argument. Not many people have looked into this before, so more sort of research needs to be done to sort of see if my estimate is an outlier, or if we can find some more research on this would be definitely beneficial for all of us. But at the moment, these are my estimates, and they're pretty shocking.
Well, we're going to see some empirical suggestion as to how good this research is, aren't we, Sue? Because the government's going to be turning off these additional welfare payments at some point. Do you think that the bigger argument here that you've made, that it's time that we actually reframe the argument about welfare, because then we can start to, as you say, target it better and use it more efficiently when the next crisis comes along?
I think we need to reframe everything we think about the welfare system in this country. Unfortunately, because of, I guess, largely political reasons, because of business reasons, because newspapers sell lots of papers when they start talking about welfare recipients, we've ended up in a situation where all of our way that we think about welfare is completely inverted. I mean, take me, for example. I posted this blog based on this paper that we're talking about a few days ago. All the replies to my blog have been about they've been leaning on that sort of intuition that newspapers have set, which is that welfare recipients are scroungers, they're a waste of resources, you're paying people to stay at home. And the rhetoric just naturally falls back into that. And I find that itself interesting. When you present this empirical work, people are just so used to hearing about welfare being a drain on the economy. When somebody says, actually, it's the other way around, it's a wonderful thing for the economy during a recession, and people just can't seem to understand it. So that is such an indication for me that we just get welfare wrong in this country. And I think there's a lot of reasons for that, a lot of political reasons that perhaps is a topic for an entirely different podcast. But from an economic standpoint, it's entirely inefficient, and it's dangerous because we're starting to fall into these traps where we think about welfare in the inverse. We think about things in terms of how we're told to think about it rather than in reality. And that means that we avoid the positive effects of raising welfare because we just can't seem to think of ourselves to do it. And we start cutting things, you start cutting welfare to try and save money, when actually, really, you're costing yourself money. It's completely counterproductive. So there needs to be an entirely different way that we look at welfare, and a lot of work needs to be done on that. And I can't tell you how we're going to change the debate, but it needs to happen sooner rather than later.
That response is what the economist Simon Redder-Lewis calls media macro, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah.
But Max, very interesting. Thank you very much.
No problem. Thanks for having me.
Max's paper is called The Importance of Being Earners, Modelling the Implications of Changes to Welfare Contributions on Macroeconomic Recovery. It's in COVID Economics 82. Well, that's it for our coverage of COVID economics for now. We hope you've enjoyed these videos over the last 18 months, and do remember that the whole COVID economics archive is free and open access at CEPR.org.